terrorists found their targets, and their targets were journalists. This was a clear attack on the freedom of expression, on press, and on satire.
Activists? How about terrorists, murderers, jihadists? Joining us now, Fred Francis, former NBC News senior correspondent. K.T. McFarland, Fox's national security analyst and a former Defense Department official in the Reagan administration. And Mara Liasson of National Public Radio, a Fox News contributor. Fred, let's take a moment as up to 1 million people gathering on the streets of Paris today in a unity march. We don't usually cast satirists as great champions of free speech, but the journalists at Charlie Hebdo proved that wrong.
Yeah, they were champions of free speech. I don't think it would work in this country. I found it offensive most of the time when I saw it. But that's part of the joy of a democracy, that you can do this, that you can be offensive, be cruel, be racist if you want. They were very often that way. And so we've lost them, but in losing them, look what's happened here. You know, we have 1 million people on the streets of Paris right now. Maybe there will be some change.
We've lost certainly the individuals who were killed, but the paper plans to publish next week. It's very interesting.
See how long they go on.
Also, Charbonnier's girlfriend said in an interview that they didn't marry or have kids because he knew he would die. KT, there's been a media debate driven in part by Fox. President Obama has fallen short. We saw a little bit of it earlier because he won't refer to these killers as Islamic terrorists. Is that linguistic question a more important issue right now?
It's a fundamental question, because unless you call it what it is, you don't know how to go after it and get it. This is an assault against Western values. And the targeting of journalists in Paris, that's very similar to what ISIS did. They targeted journalists. They captured journalists in Syria and Iraq. They beheaded journalists and then put videos out about it. Why? Because they wanted to show the world, don't mess with us. Don't report on what we're doing. Don't offend us. This is how we respond.
It's an important debate, no doubt, Mara Liasson, but in terms of what happened in France this week, even French leaders admit this was a failure of French intelligence, and yet there's this whole debate, an important debate, a healthy debate, about President Obama's role. Is that misdirected?
I don't think it's misdirected. I think that something very important happened in the reaction to this event. You now see today European leaders from all over the place converging in Paris, marching in this march. They are calling this radical Islamic, the ideology that gave root to this. And I think that at this point, for the president, he doesn't even have to cross some kind of line. He can lead from behind. He can state the obvious now and join the rest of the world in naming this what it is. But in terms of the strategy and how you go after this and the failures of French intelligence, this is going to be a huge debate. These people were on lists, they were being followed, but according to the French officials, there just wasn't the resources to track every single one of these people all the time.
This isn't just a failure of French intelligence. This is a failure of intelligence throughout Europe. They have dropped the ball. They are overwhelmed by radical Islam.
And do you think the coverage is adequately reflecting that?
No, nobody's even spoken of it. The fact is that you cannot cover, as an intelligence agency, radical Islam in Europe because it's so overwhelming. They have not spent the money to do it, neither the French nor the Germans. Okay, and until they do that, we're going to have what we had here.
Let me move you to another part of the media reaction. That is, there has been a great debate about whether or not news organizations, as a gesture of solidarity, should run these cartoons, Charlie Hebdo. And let me play for you something that Fox News contributor Ralph Peters said the other day, and we'll get your reaction on the other side.
The correct response to this attack by all of us in journalism, we pretend to be so brave. If we had guts, those cartoons would be reprinted on the front page of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the LA Times tomorrow. They won't be. We will, and again, we'll cry, but we're going to continue to self-censor.
The Washington Post did run one of the cartoons, but KT, is it cowardly not to run these cartoons?
I understand individually why organizations don't want to do it, because they're worried they're going to put their own people out there at risk. If everybody did it, if everybody ran these pictures and said this is what incited the violence, this is the excuse radical jihad works, then I think it would be a very strong statement. Because what do we have? We have all the journalists clucking moral high ground, we stand with Charlie, but they're not doing it themselves.
Well, we've seen those cartoons reprinted in a lot of places. And Denmark, I think, is a really good example of this. The publication that first published the cartoon that got the Danish journalist killed, and Charlie Hebdo reprinted it and got firebombed. Every paper in Denmark apparently is now publishing them, except for that one who says they have to protect their own people.
Before you go, let me run through some of the explanations. Fox News is not running the cartoons. Fox is saying that the safety of its correspondents and questions of taste are at issue here. CNN President Jeff Zucker says he's torn. He wants to run them, but he told his staff protecting and taking care of the safety of our employees around the world is more important right now.
And see, I agree with that. I don't agree that you run these, because if you are a worldwide news organization and you're standing in a street in Belgium or you're in Beirut and it says CNN or you're the New York Times, you are a target. You are a big target if you run these things, and I feel safe as a journalist in this country. I don't have to worry about that in this country. But overseas,
if you have correspondents around the world,
you have overseas correspondents, you need to be worried.
New York Times explanation, by the way, we did not normally publish images or other material deliberately intended to offend religious sensibilities. And by the way, there are consequences here. Last night, a newspaper in Germany, this is the Hamburger Morgenpost, was the subject of an arson attack. That paper had run the Charlie Hebdo cartoons.
Yeah, I completely disagree. If there is any guts, if there is any courage, if there is any role that a free media has, it is to go out and call it what it is. If we're already self-censoring, if we're already cowering under the desk because, well, we're afraid of this, we're afraid of that, then you know what? Free speech is already lost.
KT, you've never been a journalist on the front line where you've got guns from one faction over here and guns from one faction over there, and they know that you represent America. They don't know that you represent NBC News or Fox News. You represent America. You're a target. I say don't run the cartoons.
Why is it more than a symbolic gesture? In other words, what I would like to see in response to these heinous acts is more and continued aggressive reporting on Islamic terrorists, commentary, even mockery. But to run the cartoons, some of which are offensive to various people's religious sensibilities. I mean, there's a cartoon that showed the toilet paper labeled the Bible, the Torah, the Quran, all religions in the toilet. I would defend Charlie Hebdo's right to run that stuff, but I don't know that I want it in my column or on my air.
Okay, but then the responsibility then is to go into those no-go zones, to go into the no-go zones throughout Europe, in France, in Germany, in Switzerland, in Sweden, in Britain, and report on what's going on. Those are places where journalists don't go.
But also, I think there has been in the press this week the beginnings of something that I hope continues, which is reporting on the Muslim community and how radical Islam fits in, what the Muslim community is doing to expel it or not doing to expel it. And that, I think, is one of the most important things to solve this problem, and that has to be a serious, concerted effort on the part of journalists.
That's happened this week because it's a hot story this week.
It has to continue.
Well, I'm sorry, but it's not going to continue next week. I don't believe it. I mean, I don't believe that moderate clerics are going to take up this cry. They haven't. They've had plenty of opportunity since 9/11 to do so. They haven't.
I would just add that we also need to look, and we're seeing some stirrings of that, at anti-Semitism in France, and there's no accident that a kosher supermarket was picked as one of the places where hostages were taken. But, again, to come back to the courage of the people who ran this Charlie Hebdo newspaper, I mean, the office was firebombed in 2011 after the paper ran a Muhammad cartoon that offended many Muslims. And I don't want to in any way imply that the newspaper was responsible for this barbaric act. But there was an ongoing argument, and then had been criticized by some French officials, by the Obama White House in 2012, that paper was being unnecessarily insulting or provocative toward religion.
But this has changed that. In other words, this is transcended.
That debate is out the window?
I think it's out the window.
You can't blame the...
You don't blame the victim.
Or this is not the time to have this debate. Now it's about a principle, a Western value.
But you were very candid in saying that some of this stuff you find offensive or racist. And you don't want to defend it.
No, I defend their right to do it, but I can't.
And that's what we're talking about.
What does the American military say? I am offended by what you say, but I will die for your right to say it.
And they do every day.
But in fact, the French don't. Okay? If we see 1 million people in the streets of Paris today, are they willing to put troops on the ground to go after radical Islam?
They are putting. That's why the terrorists said they were attacking Charlie Hebdo, because French troops were in the Middle East.
Serious numbers of troops on the ground. We're talking about absolutely going. If they want to be martyrs, Let's make it so. We haven't seen the French do that.
I think the most important point here is that this is a hot story now, but we all know how the media run from one crisis to the next. This cannot be forgotten about. And the other overarching message that I take away is that freedom of speech means freedom you have to protect odious speech, offensive speech, otherwise it is meaningless. I'm sure you have a lot of opinions out there. Tweet me at Howard Kurtz. We're going to read some of your messages later ahead.